I had just stepped through the door after a grueling day at work, my shoulders sagging under the weight of exhaustion. All I longed for was a warm meal, a brief moment of peace, and maybe some time to unwind with my wife. That wasn't too much to ask for, was it? But instead of comfort, I was met with silence and the unmistakable scent of something reheated, or worse, takeout yet again. The dining table was buried under a mess of shopping bags, each from upscale boutiques, their logos practically shouting extravagance. The irony didn't escape me as I set my briefcase down with a sigh. Here I was, pushing myself to the limit to provide for us, while she lounged on the couch, scrolling through her phone without even acknowledging my presence. "Hey," I greeted, keeping my tone as neutral as possible, despite the frustration simmering beneath. "What's for dinner?" She didn't even look up. "I ordered something. It'll be here soon." It wasn't the first time. In fact, it had become the norm. The meals she used to prepare, her lasagna, her slow-cooked stews, were now nothing but distant memories. The kitchen had become more of a decorative space than a place of use, a silent testament to the changes in our home. But it wasn't just the food. The house itself had started slipping into disorder. Dishes piled up in the sink, laundry sat in heaps, and the once spotless floors now looked like they hadn't been cleaned in weeks. I didn't want to argue. I was too drained for another fight. But as I took in my surroundings, a slow, creeping resentment took hold. I worked myself to the bone, taking on extra projects, enduring stress and sleepless nights just to ensure we lived comfortably. And what did I get in return? A wife who seemed indifferent, not only to the state of our home, but to me as well. Later that evening, after the takeout containers had been discarded and the silence between us had grown almost suffocating, I decided it was time to say something. "Listen, we need to talk," I began cautiously. She let out a dramatic sigh, her irritation barely concealed. "About what now?" "About this. About us. I can't keep doing this alone. I need your support." Her response hit harder than I expected. "I didn't marry you to be your maid or personal chef. If that's what you want, hire someone." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. My mind reeled. This wasn't the woman I had married, the woman who once cared about us, about our home, about me. I tried to reason with her, to explain how I felt, but she dismissed me with a careless wave of her hand, muttering that she had better things to do than argue over something so trivial. That was when it truly sank in. She wasn't just neglecting the house, she was neglecting us. It felt like I had been reduced to nothing more than an ATM, a means to fund her lavish lifestyle. And the worst part? She didn't seem to feel even the slightest bit of guilt. As I lay in bed that night, staring blankly at the ceiling, exhaustion gave way to simmering anger. Something had to change. I couldn't keep coming home to this, to the lack of appreciation, the emotional distance, the cold indifference. The bond we once had was unraveling, and I wasn't sure how much more of it I could endure. The next morning, after that draining conversation, I woke up still seething. Even before I opened my eyes, I could feel the tension lingering in the air. She had already gotten out of bed and was seated in the living room, leisurely sipping her coffee as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, I was preparing for yet another demanding day at work, already weighed down by the frustration from the night before. I considered ignoring it, sweeping it under the rug like I had so many times before. But something inside me snapped. This time, I refused to let it slide. Grabbing my coffee, I sat across from her, trying one last time to close the widening gap between us. "Look," I began, keeping my tone as steady as I could manage. "I don't think you understand how much this is affecting me." She didn't even acknowledge me at first, her gaze fixed on her phone as she scrolled absent-mindedly. When she finally glanced up, her expression was one of pure irritation. "Why are we doing this again?" She sighed. "I told you last night. I'm not your maid. I'm not here to cater to your every whim." The sheer coldness in her voice stung like a slap. "That's not what I'm asking for," I countered, my voice rising despite my attempt to keep calm. "I want a partner, someone who contributes, someone who cares about this marriage as much as I do." Her laugh was sharp, bitter, almost mocking. "You think this is a partnership?" she scoffed. "Let's get one thing straight. I didn't sign up to be your servant. I have my own life, my own priorities. If you don't like it, that's your problem." Her words sent an unsettling chill through me. This wasn't just an argument, it was a declaration. She had drawn a line in the sand, making it clear she saw no issue with how things were. She wasn't willing to change, to compromise, or even to acknowledge the sacrifices I was making. "What about us?" I asked, my frustration now laced with something deeper, hurt. "Do you even care about what's happening to us?" She sighed dramatically as if the conversation was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Look, I've told you before, if you want a housewife who cooks, cleans, and does everything you expect, you married the wrong woman. I'm not going to change just because you feel unappreciated." And just like that, it hit me. The divide between us wasn't just growing, it was already there, gaping, undeniable. She didn't see this marriage as a partnership. To her, it was a one-sided transaction. My hard work funding her comfortable lifestyle while she remained free of responsibility. Before leaving for work, I stood by the door, watching her as she lazily flipped through TV channels, her expression blank, indifferent. "This isn't sustainable," I said, my voice low but firm. "Something's got to give." Her response was as cutting as ever. "Then maybe you should figure out what you really want," she said flatly, "because I'm not changing." As I stepped out the door, her words echoed in my head, and for the first time, I truly saw her for what she was. This wasn't the woman I had fallen in love with. This was someone who cared more about her own comfort, her own image, than about the person standing beside her. And for the first time, I wondered if this marriage was even worth fighting for anymore. That day at work, I couldn't concentrate. Her words replayed in my head like a broken record. "I'm not changing." The finality of it stung. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it, like my feelings were nothing more than an inconvenience. During my lunch break, I found myself staring at my phone, scrolling through old photos of us, pictures from a time when things were different, when things were good, when she still looked at me like I mattered. I searched for answers, trying to pinpoint the moment everything shifted. But I came up empty. All I knew for certain was one thing. I couldn't keep living like this. By the time I got home, my decision was made. If she wasn't going to change, then I had to. No more enabling her irresponsibility. No more allowing myself to be taken for granted. I didn't walk in ready for another argument. Instead, I went straight to the bedroom, grabbed my laptop, and logged into our joint accounts. She was too engrossed in whatever reality show was playing to even notice when I started making changes. One by one, I canceled her extra credit cards, leaving her with only one, but this time with a strict spending limit. If she wanted anything beyond that, she'd have to figure it out on her own. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, determined to follow through. While she slept in, as always, I took a deep dive into our finances. I combed through every bill, every frivolous expense she had racked up over the past few months. Designer handbags, overpriced dinners, endless spa appointments. It was infuriating to see it all laid out in black and white. But instead of confronting her immediately, I chose to let reality hit her first. It didn't take long. That evening she stormed into the room, phone in hand, her expression a mix of outrage and disbelief. "Why is my card being declined?" she snapped, entitlement dripping from her tone. I didn't even bother looking up from the book I was reading. "I adjusted the limits," I said calmly. "If you want to spend more, you're going to have to start contributing." Her reaction was exactly what I expected. "Contributing?" she scoffed. "I'm your wife, not your employee. What the hell is wrong with you?" I closed my book and met her glare head on, unwilling to back down. "And I'm your husband, not your personal bank," I replied, my voice firm. "If you don't want to contribute to the household or this relationship, then you're going to have to start handling your own expenses." Her face turned red with fury. "So, this is your way of punishing me because I won't play housewife for you? That's pathetic." "No," I said, my tone unwavering. "This is about boundaries. You don't want to be an equal partner in this marriage? Fine. But you don't get to live off my hard work without accountability." The next few days were tense. She sulked around, threw sarcastic remarks my way, and even tried guilt-tripping me with lines like, "I guess you just don't love me anymore." But I refused to let her manipulate me. When she attempted to buy an expensive pair of shoes and her card was declined, she lashed out again, calling me controlling. But I didn't take the bait. I simply repeated what I had told her before. If you want luxuries, you can earn them. What struck me most wasn't her anger. It was how quickly the dynamic between us shifted. She began avoiding me, spending more and more time out with her friends. I overheard her on the phone, painting herself as the victim, twisting the situation to make it seem like I was the villain. But I didn't care. I wasn't doing this for her approval. I was doing it for my own sanity. For the first time in years, I felt like I was reclaiming control over my life. This wasn't about the money. It was about respect. I had spent so long bending over backward to keep her happy, but now I saw the truth. Her happiness had never been tied to us. It had always been tied to what I could provide for her. And I was done being her safety net. Each night as I lay in bed, a growing sense of clarity settled over me. This wasn't just about cutting off her reckless spending. It was about drawing the line on what I was willing to tolerate. And with each passing day, I felt myself inching closer to a decision I never thought I'd have to make. It didn't take long for the cracks in her carefully curated facade to start showing. The first sign, the delivery driver. I heard the doorbell ring in her hushed, panicked voice as she tried to explain why her payment wasn't going through. It was almost comical, the way she fumbled, scrambling to blame the declined payment on a bank error. But no amount of excuses could change the reality. In the end, she had no choice but to cancel the order, slamming the door in frustration, the sound echoing through the house. I didn't say a word. I simply sat there, watching as she struggled to come to terms with living within limits for the first time in her life. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few days, her frustration morphed into something closer to desperation. I noticed her digging through the back of her closet, pulling out old clothes she hadn't worn in years, trying to make them work because another impulsive shopping spree was no longer an option. Her favorite spa left a voicemail about a missed appointment, one she couldn't afford to reschedule. She deleted the message without responding, and when her friends invited her out for their usual extravagant brunches, she suddenly had a list of excuses. Feeling under the weather, too busy at home. I knew better. She wasn't sick, and she wasn't busy. She just couldn't keep up with their lifestyles without my financial backing. And slowly, that realization was isolating her. One night, I walked into the kitchen to find her sitting at the table, staring down at her phone. Her nails, once always manicured to perfection, were chipped. Her makeup-free face looked pale, tired, almost defeated. I poured myself a glass of water, leaning against the counter, waiting for her to speak first. "I'm doing everything I can to make this work," she murmured suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you're making it impossible." I took a slow sip before answering. "Making what work? Your lifestyle? The one I've been single-handedly supporting while you refuse to lift a finger?" Her head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "You're being cruel." "Cruel?" I set my glass down, patience wearing thin. "Number cruel is expecting me to carry this marriage while you sit back and do nothing. Cruel is disregarding everything I do to keep a roof over our heads. Cruel is playing the victim when all I've ever asked for is basic partnership." She flinched but said nothing, and for the first time, I saw something in her expression that I hadn't seen before. Doubt. Doubt in her choices. Doubt in how she had been treating me. Doubt in herself. As the days passed, her demeanor shifted. She stopped complaining as much, though the silence between us grew heavier. Once, I even caught her trying to tidy up the living room, though her efforts were hesitant, uncertain. It wasn't about the cleaning itself. It was the way she moved, like she was searching for a way to fix what had already been broken. Her friends started noticing the change too. One of them called while she was out, and when I picked up, the voice on the other end sounded surprised. "Is everything okay with her? She's been so distant lately." I didn't have the energy or the heart to explain. "She's fine," I said, keeping my response short before ending the call. But we both knew she wasn't fine. She was finally seeing the truth, that the world she had built for herself, a life of ease and indulgence funded entirely by me, was crumbling. And for the first time in years, she had no one to lean on. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, eating a simple meal I had prepared, she finally broke the silence. "I've been thinking," she said hesitantly. "Maybe I haven't been fair to you." Her words were a small crack in the wall she had built around herself. But they came too late. I looked at her, waiting for more, but she didn't elaborate. Instead, she picked at her plate, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her own admission. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The silence between us said more than words ever could. She was beginning to grasp the reality of her actions, or her inaction. But the damage had already been done, and as I sat there, watching her across the table, I realized something. I wasn't sure if I could ever look at her the same way again. After her small admission at dinner, I had hoped things might start to change, but as the days passed, it became clear that her efforts were superficial at best. She didn't slip back into her old habits entirely, but whatever attempts she made to make amends felt half-hearted. She would tidy up here and there, make small gestures that seemed more performative than sincere, and occasionally throw out a comment that hinted at remorse. But it wasn't enough, not for the years of neglect, not for the entitlement I had endured, and frankly, I no longer had the patience to pretend otherwise. One evening, about a week later, she approached me as I sat in the living room, reviewing work emails. Her expression was softer than I had seen in months, almost vulnerable. She hesitated in the doorway, gripping the frame as though she needed it for support. For a fleeting moment, I thought she might finally have something meaningful to say. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost trembling. I set my laptop aside and gestured for her to sit. She perched on the edge of the couch, hands twisting in her lap, like she was afraid they might betray her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she looked small, uncertain. "I've been thinking," she began, staring down at the carpet, "about everything you said, about how I've treated you." She swallowed hard before continuing. "And you're right. I haven't been fair to you." I remained silent, watching as she struggled to find the right words. "I guess I just—" She trailed off, taking a deep breath before pressing on. "I got comfortable, too comfortable. I took you for granted, and I didn't realize how much it was hurting you." Finally, she looked up. Her eyes were glassy, on the verge of tears. "I know I've made mistakes, big ones, but I don't want to lose you. I want to fix this. I'll do better, I promise." Her words hung between us, thick with emotion. For the first time in years, she sounded genuine. And maybe, just maybe, a part of me wanted to believe her, to give her another chance. But the bigger part of me, the part that had endured her indifference, her entitlement, her disregard for our partnership, couldn't be swayed by words alone. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees as I met her gaze. "I hear what you're saying," I said carefully, "and I appreciate that you're finally acknowledging the damage you've done. But this isn't something you can fix with an apology or a promise." I exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The trust, the respect, it's gone. And I don't think it's something we can get back. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might completely break down. But then, just as quickly, she straightened her back. The sorrow in her expression shifted, desperation creeping in. "I can change," she insisted, voice thick with urgency. "I'll do whatever it takes. Please just give me a chance." I shook my head, the weight of my decision settling over me like a heavy blanket. "You've had chances, more than I can count, and every time, you chose yourself over us." I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep hoping for something that isn't there." She reached out, grasping my hand, not in connection, but in desperation, as if holding on could somehow change the inevitable. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I love you." I pulled my hand back, gently but firmly. "I needed your love when it mattered, when I came home exhausted and just wanted a partner, when I asked for help, and you dismissed me." I met her gaze, the finality of my words settling between us like a chasm too wide to cross. Love isn't enough anymore, not after everything. Her tears finally spilled over, silent streams running down her cheeks. But I didn't feel satisfaction or vindication, just a deep, weary sadness. This wasn't how I wanted things to end, but it was the only way forward. She stayed there for a while, crying softly while I sat in silence. Eventually, she got up and left the room, retreating into herself, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The woman I had once adored, the woman I had built a life with, was now a stranger, and no amount of promises or tears could change that. After that night, the house fell into a silence that felt more oppressive than peaceful. She kept her distance, moving into the guest room and avoiding me entirely. No more pleading, no more empty promises of change. It was as if she had finally accepted what I had been trying to tell her for weeks, that the bridge between us was burned and there was no rebuilding it. I woke early on Saturday morning, the weight of my decision pressing heavy on my chest. It was time to close this chapter of my life. As I walked through the quiet house, I took in the remnants of the life we had once tried to build together. The framed wedding photo on the mantel, the expensive furniture we had never really used, the decor she had carefully picked out, pieces of a home that had once felt full of promise. Now, it all felt hollow. I grabbed a roll of garbage bags and started packing her things, her clothes, her designer handbags, the shoes that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. One by one, I stuffed them into black bags. With each item I packed away, I felt lighter, like I was shedding the weight I had been carrying for years. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I was just done. By the time she woke up, I had nearly finished. She walked into the living room, rubbing her eyes, and then froze. Her gaze flickered over the bags lined up by the door, and I watched her expression shift, first confusion, then disbelief, and finally, anger. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. I turned to her, my voice calm, steady. "This is me moving on." Her eyes widened as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. For a fleeting moment, I thought she might argue, but then she crossed her arms, her voice dipping into a defensive sneer. "You can't just throw me out. Where am I supposed to go?" I met her gaze, unwavering. "That's not my concern anymore. You've made it clear that you don't need me, remember? So prove it. Go build the life you think you deserve, but do it on your own." She stared at me like she didn't recognize the man standing in front of her. Maybe she didn't. Maybe, for the first time in years, I was finally standing up for myself in a way she never expected. Her confidence wavered, and she tried one last time. "I can change," she said, her voice quieter now, almost pleading. "We can fix this." I shook my head. "You had the chance to change, to fix things when it mattered." I sighed, the finality settling in. "I'm not angry anymore, but I can't keep living like this. I deserve better." Her silence spoke louder than any argument she could have made. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her footsteps retreating down the hall to the guest room. I didn't follow. Instead, I finished packing the last of her things and lined the bags up by the door. Later that afternoon, she called a friend to pick her up. She didn't say goodbye when she left, just grabbed her bags and walked out the door without looking back. I watched from the window as the car pulled away, feeling something I hadn't expected. Relief. The house was quiet, but for the first time, the silence didn't feel suffocating. It felt freeing. Over the next few weeks, I started reclaiming my life. I rearranged the furniture, took down the wedding photos, and donated the things we had bought together that no longer held meaning. For the first time in years, the house felt like mine, a space where I could breathe, where I could start over. Friends began reaching out, asking how I was doing. I told them the truth. I was better than I had been in years. I reconnected with people. I went out more. I rediscovered the things I loved. Slowly but surely, I started to feel like myself again. One evening, as I sat on the back porch with a glass of wine, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt it. The weight I had carried for so long, the frustration, the resentment, the exhaustion, was gone. In its place was something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see what the future might hold.